well, welcome to, you not ready? You ready, Mark?
Sure.
Okay. Welcome to the second session. There was another talk that had been scheduled that got canceled. Today, Mark has another one to replace it, specifically related to inflection points. And I'm looking forward to this talk. You may have seen Mark this morning at the introducing at the keynote. He's been a leader in the Unicode consortium pretty much since its beginning, and is one of the key leaders on internationalization and localization at Google. Welcome, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much. So my talk is going to be about inflection points. And the first thing is that agreement is really difficult. And you might say, well, what are you talking about? What I'm talking about in this session is grammatical agreement. And grammatical agreement is a problem when we're dealing with computers because computers have to compose messages for people. And the biggest mechanism for doing that is you have some kind of pattern with placeholders. And so you stick things into the placeholders and you want a message for the user. Now, in the old days, before people did this, they would just concatenate chunks of text together and display it to the user, which was horrible for the user because a lot of times things don't come in the same order as they are in English. It was hard to translate and so forth. Nowadays, people use messages for the bulk of the translated messages, of the translated text that goes to the user. And I'll talk a little bit about some more sophisticated methods. So these placeholders are used, and they're very commonly used. And here's the problem with them is that if you take the first message, I say number reports are incomplete, so please add receipts for them. I'm going to replace number by 1 or 3 or 5 or something. And even in English, you replace it by 1, then you get 1 reports are incomplete, so please add receipts for them. And you really want 1 report is complete, so please add a receipt for it. So you have to change the message because of the number, and that's the kind of agreement, grammatical agreement I'm talking about. So there are 2 parts of that. One is sometimes we have to change the message because of the placeholder, and sometimes we have to change the placeholder because of the message. And both of those are important. And sometimes, of course, you have to do both. Languages are complicated. This is trickier than it seems. So what types of placeholder agreement do we have? Basically, their numbers are a key one. We display numbers in messages to users all the time. Gender starts to get important. And by this, I don't necessarily mean personal gender, the gender of people, although that is important. There are a lot of languages where if I just say welcome, and I'm expressing welcome to a person, then I have to make the welcome be either masculine or feminine based upon who I'm talking to. And it feels odd if the computer is saying welcome to me and it's using the feminine form, or it feels odd if it says welcome to me if I were a woman and it was using the masculine form. Case is important, and by that I mean grammatical case. And English is very poor with cases. We really only have retained cases for pronouns. So you say, he took the book and gave it to her. You say himself, it's his. We have cases for pronouns, but we've really tossed them all for nouns. But a lot of languages, it's a crucial feature of how the language works. And if you use the wrong case, it's like using the wrong pronoun in English. And a lot of times they really correspond to it. Instead of saying, in March, I will use a special grammatical case on the word for March, which merges into the word in interesting ways. There's also definiteness, and in a lot of languages, definiteness, like the book versus a book, is important, and it's also glued into the word, which makes it difficult to deal with for placeholders. And then there are some phonetic agreements, and I'll talk about these a little bit more. I'm going to focus on what we're doing in Unicode and ICU and CLDR. And just a brief introduction, CLDR is the part of the Unicode Consortium's work that deals with language-specific data. And so these are for a lot of the internationalization services that people need. How do I format dates and times and numbers and currencies? And how do I do short forms like 3M for 3 million? And how do I do a whole host of these things that are really core to making your phone work right? A second thing is ICU, and ICU supplies the code that literally billions of devices around the planet are using to get at and use CLDR and Unicode properly. And ICU goes much beyond those as well. It has a lot of services that go beyond those two repositories of information. So given that focus, languages really fall into a couple different categories, and one of them is analytic versus synthetic. And in a purely analytic language, placeholders would be absolutely simple, because you don't have any number agreement, you don't have any case agreement, you don't have any gender agreement. I don't say 3 reports are, I just say 3 report is, because the verb is there, it's the same form all the time, the noun is there, it's the same form, no plurals, nothing. And the fully analytic languages are, some examples are Chinese. Is fully analytic. It's determined by the choice of words and the placement. You don't have to have these kinds of grammatical agreements. English is fairly analytic, but not fully. If I use a genitive in English, I say John's book, then that is almost analytic in that I can almost always write apostrophe S. But of course, if it's a plural, then it's different. So there are these odd edge cases. So English is fairly analytic, but then you get into a lot of synthetic languages where you just glom a whole bunch of stuff into a word. And those get very difficult to work with for placeholders. So, and we have to deal with them because the world is the way it is, not the way we might theoretically want it to be. So there are alternatives to using placeholders. You can have apparatus which people are working on a lot these days to really build complex sentences, grammatical sentences, and those take quite sophisticated technology in order to do properly in different languages. A lot of work goes into that in products like Siri or Google Assistant or Google Translate. These are big services, very complicated, and a lot of work. So there's still there's this whole category of things where you can't go through all of that process in order to give simple messages to people. AI, of course, has made tremendous progress in recent years. When I was younger, AI was always the thing that was going to happen in 10 years. And it was, each 10 years it was going to happen in the next 10 years. But of course, we've seen an explosion recently in capabilities and applications of AI. But it's not there in the sense that we can depend upon it for properly structured messages at this point. So these are things we're going to have to deal with for some time into the future. Let me go into some of the complications here. Number agreement, one of the key things is that number agreement doesn't mean a classical plural and singular. Okay, what we mean by number agreement is when I change a number to a different number, how do I have to change the rest of the sentence? that's not just simple singular and plural. There are a lot of languages where, well, if the number is, say, 3, then all of a sudden I use the vocative for instead of a different case for the number. So classically speaking, you'd say that, for example, Russian has singular and plural, but in reality, when you change the digit, you actually have to change it for whether it's 2 to 4 or 5 or above, and you definitely have to change it when you're using fractions. Fractions are often, you have to put things into genitive for them. So it's a broader than the classical notion of singular and plural, and for a lot of these languages, the best English analogy is first, second, third, where I have multiple categories, and when I'm composing a message with, I have to say one ST if I'm using the first form, and it's 21st, but it's not 11th, it's not 11th. So there are particular rules that you have to use in order to form these number categories. And the category is the thing that you use to pick which message you're going to use. So the categories are, in CLDR, are 0, 1, 2, 3, few, many, and other. And these are the categories that we found that cover all the languages that we're currently working with. It's conceivable that we could get languages that need more than this in the future, but as of yet, we haven't hit that. And category 1 means more than just one. As we saw with 21st and first, if I'm talking about ordinals, category 1 includes 1 and 21 and 31 and 131, but not 111. So you have these complicated rules that try to figure this out, and plurals are a horror. In some languages, fractions are a horror. In some languages, the category of the fraction is given by the last digit of the fraction. So 1.21, I would put it in category 1. Some of them, it's the last 2 digits, so I would put it in 21. And in some languages, it's like the last 2 digits, but going in an even number of digits from the start. So if it's got 3 digits, I treat it as 1, and then in the other one, it's a mess. As I said, we use a functional definition, so it's not the classic definition. And it also, in some cases, includes pluralization for languages that have what are called mutations, where the words next to a number have to change. And Welsh is a key example of that. There are 3 or 4 different mutations, and depending upon which number you use, you have to change the message because of these mutations. Okay. The other thing that's important is that we are looking at a choice of things. When we look at the number category, we're going to depend upon the translator translating each one of the possible messages. We're not actually constructing the sentence grammatically from pieces. We're saying, pick the sentence that matches the category based upon the category coming in. We're going to pick the sentence to use, and the translator has already made sure that it matches the right category. So we're not trying to construct the sentence at runtime. We're not invoking any complicated mechanism to do that. We're just pick the category, pick the sentence, substitute the placeholder. There are some special cases, and the one at the bottom is good. For French, we actually have a special third plural case, which is for things over 1 million. And the reason is, in French, if you have more than 1 million things, then you have to insert a de, because million is a different category of thing than million is a different category of thing than mille. And that's just the way the language works. Gender agreements, more than your simple French masculine or feminine or your German masculine, feminine, neuter, it can also include things like animacy. If you look at Polish, for example, Polish separates the masculine into two categories. There's masculine with animate and there's masculine with inanimate. And so you get more than the classical 2 or 3 different plurals. Definiteness is like English, the, that's, the, this, these are all definite, and indefinite are a, some, and an, and they depend upon how you structure the sentence. But English is one of those, in this case it's pretty analytic, we don't have to care much, but in a lot of languages you glue the determiner onto a word and perhaps change the word a little bit because you need to get the vowel to be right and so forth. So it gets more complicated. This is, however, generally of lesser importance for the placeholder determination because typically the thing you're substituting is going to be definite in the sentence. And so you don't necessarily have to worry about it as much, definite or not, depending upon what the translator says. And phonetic agreement is where I have to switch things around a little bit. I need to make these micro adjustments to the sentence because I have to elide a particular vowel or change it or consonant. In English, the one example that's good is a versus an. And it's not trivial. You say a versus an, that's fine, and it's for the vast majority of words. You just look at the word and you're done. But we do say a university because university starts with a consonant, even though it's not written that way. And there's no way in English to distinguish between a university and an upset. Or the classic H, where you don't know where the H is silent or not. And this happens with a lot of languages. You need to know the spelling. And English is one of those phonetically challenged languages, so you have to take care of a lot of things. When you take a look at English pronunciation, you really need a dictionary lookup in order to do it properly. So CLDR and ICU have long offered support for number agreement, have some limited support for dates and personal gender, and we're now working on cases. And we're starting off first with units of measurement. And units of measurement like kilometers, meters, kilograms, pounds, ounces, and so on. So what we've developed, and part of this is coming in, we have standard internal identifiers for these units of measure. And these all are things that you wouldn't show a user, but we use to say, well, this is a kilometer that I want to display. The identifiers offer composition, so I can have a Newton meter, a kilogram hour, I can have a meter per second, I can have miles per hour, or seconds per mile, whatever. The prefixes, kilometers, square kilometer, and so forth, and some special prefixes because there are some languages in which you measure things like liters per 100 kilometers. So you actually throw in numbers into the unit. And you also have mixed units. So I say in English, I say I'm 6 foot 2 inches. In lots of languages, you say it's 3 degrees and 5 minutes, and so forth. The formatting part is where I take meter per square second and I turn into German, and it's 1 Meter pro Quadratsekunde. And this takes generative compounds of unusual units and explicit compounds of common units. So we translate the common units like kilometer, but we don't translate like picometer or something like that explicitly. For those, we depend upon combination. And I'll get into an issue with that as well. Part of this is that the programmer wants to hand off to an internationalization service and say, here, I know the user's height is 1.88 meters. Given this locale, given the fact that I'm talking about a person and not a mountain, what's the best unit to use? And so we end up with usage being a key feature. I want to say for a child, for a baby, I'm going to say the baby is 18 inches long. Okay, I don't say 1 foot 6 inches tall. But for a person, I'll say 6'2". In some countries, I'll say my height is 1.88 meters. In some countries, I'll say I'm 188 centimeters. So even if you're using metric, there are differences between how countries do this. And I remember I used to live in Switzerland, and I went in and asked for a haircut to be 3 centimeters long. And the person must have been a little hard of hearing, and it's more customary in Switzerland to use millimeters. And so he thought I said 3 millimeters long, and all gone. And of course, the preferences also require the right rounding, because if I supply something in meters and I say it's 1.88 meters, I don't want to see I am 6'2", whatever it turns out to when you do this. So you've got to supply a level of rounding that's corresponding to the kind of unit you're looking at. So our end goal for the inflections is I want to be able to format a unit like a person's height, road length, weight, etc. And I'm going to have the locale. I need to supply the usage. Am I talking about how high planes fly? Am I talking about how far away the moon is? Am I talking about a mountain? Am I talking about a person? And all of those use different usages. The unit ID, meters, for example, the particular value, 1.88, and plus the grammatical case, because I want to be able to say in my translated message that I have a placeholder that takes the dative in Slovenian and put that value in and then give it the right case so that it adopts the right format, and I end up with a grammatical message. The return value from this function call is going to be the formatted string, but it also needs to be the gender, so that I can pick the gender of the sentence based upon the thing that I just formatted, so that I can have all of the references correct in the sentence. And so that's why you need to be able to augment the message formatting structure. And there's a talk later today where you can hear more about that. You need to augment the message format structure so that the translator has the ability to say, well, in my language, in this circumstance, you're talking about height of this person, it's going to be what gender, and I can give a couple of different grammatical genders. I can select among them based upon what this value is. So the first process for adding this to CLDR is looking at the language and figuring out what are the cases and genders that the language supports. So we need to look at German and say, okay, German has 4 grammatical cases, it's got 3 genders, and it uses all of these for units. And I'll talk about why that's important. Actually, on the very same slide. It's important because we only want to present to translators as much information as they need to supply for our usage. So there are a lot of languages where I don't have the full field of grammatical cases, of gender for that language for units of measurement, because units of measurements aren't animate. So I don't have to use the masculine animate case ever when I'm dealing with units. There are languages where I have a case for vocative when I'm speaking to someone. And so I would say Mike, and I would use the vocative for Mike. But you very, very rarely speak to units of measurement. So we don't need the vocative normally for dealing with units of measurement, and we don't want to gather that extra information when it's not going to be used. So the second step is kind of limit those down for the particular case of units so that we can see, oh, there's this general case, I have this slew of cases, but I can narrow it down and I only need it for 4 grammatical cases for this particular language. Minimal pairs. Minimal pairs, it's actually a bad name. But what it means in CLDR is a set of patterns that we can use to let people know what the form they've chosen is correct in context. So we do this a lot in CLDR, so we will present, for example, we'll ask for the months, but we'll also present that within an example date so the user can see, oh, am I picking the right form for the month in a real-life example. And the minimal patterns help us to do that for units and other things. The plural minimal pattern, for example, for German is Tag or Tage, and I can use those to distinguish and give an example so that the translators can see am I using the appropriate form. For case, it gets a little trickier, but in this case you can see some examples for German. I can say für ein metrische Pint. And in German, the interesting thing is the case doesn't fully matter unless you happen to have an adjective. So it doesn't matter with the word meter because some of the cases kind of devolve together. But if I'm going to say an English gallon versus an American gallon, or I'm saying a metric pint versus an English pint, then it's the adjective that really carries the case. But remember, again, we don't actually care. We care about the function, not the sort of classic view. It's, does a change in this thing cause the rest of the sentence to change? And gender tends to be fairly easy. We can pick die Stunde ist, and that's feminine. Der Meter ist masculine, and so forth. And the patterns that you see help the user to realize, oh, I am, as a matter of fact, picking the right form, and it does match what CLDR is expecting me to put in. The next step, which Frederick knows very well, is a longish step where we present this information to the users for them to translate. Now, with cases, if you take the combination of cases and plurals, you tend to get a whole row of stuff that differs in various forms. Here you see an example. I think this is Czech. And you can see that if I look at metry, metru with a ring, it looks like, and so forth. So you see, or metrum, so you get em and so on. And all of these will vary across both of these two axes, which are the plural and the grammatical case. And here you see an example of where we're showing a minimal pair pattern to help people see what it's going to look like in context. And then a similar tricky part, which we need to work with typically linguists for, is what are the best composition rules? And how do we put together kilo and gram to make kilogram? And what's the best way in which we can formulate these? And what is the resulting gender of a compound unit depend? How does it depend upon the gender of all the components? if I have Newton meter in this language, do I take the gender of Newton or the gender of meter? If I have kilogram hour per second, well, kilogram, that would be weird, but kilogram hour per meter. Then which of the genders am I going to take, and how does that funnel into producing the final gender of the result? So we take these composition rules in order to do the best job we can with a compound, knowing that it will not be perfect. And I think, do I have an example of how it's not perfect? Oh, I don't think so, but an example is from Greek, where if I take the word for kilo and the word for meter, if I put them together, then the accent jumps from the meter to the kilo. So for correct spelling, I have to modify both pieces. And so we won't do a perfect job with any of these compounds in these really complicated languages. Our hope at this point is to have it be readable and not sort of horrible. And one of the things that some of the translators have done is they've, for example, put, instead of writing kilo just alone, they'll put kilo dash. And that looks better to the end user when that's glommed onto meter than if they just had kilo and then the accent was in the wrong place. There are some complications in some languages. For example, we have a pattern for producing square and cubic. So I can say cubic meter, cubic mile. But it turns out that the phrase I would use in Czech is I would use two different phrases depending upon whether I was talking about duration or length. And in the case of, I think it's the duration of length, I can say square. But if I'm taking duration like square second or something like that, I have to say second to the, well, it's a bad example. If I was taking hour, then I'd say hour to the second, basically. So I can't use square. Am I about time?
No, I wanted to ask a question.
Oh, sure. Sure, question's fine.
So I'm maybe a little bit confused.
Sure.
I think I understand, when you're talking about units, you're talking about categorizing them for gender so that you can store all the possible values in CLDR and ICU. But when you were talking about giving help to translators, maybe a slide or two back, it seemed to me that was more for when people are using, when they're dealing with messages, that was to help the translators with other content that they're using with, not this slide, I think the one prior. Yeah, so it's not about the data that you're making available, but the construction of sentences that people are using that data, and those translators need the information about what is going to be, what the choices are that they're being offered. Do you follow? So sometimes there's the process that you need to construct all the different offerings you have, but then also when people are using ICU, what it is you're giving a translator to make the selections, and it's not always clear to me where in the process, which translators you're referring to.
These are primarily for use in CLDR to help the translators, so that if the translator is wondering, well, is this the right form, they can see the fact that when they put it in, oh, the month form is wrong. I'm using the standalone form instead of the formatting form. Or if I'm using the wrong plural, I'm using the wrong case, they can see it if they see it in a message.
So this is all the offerings that will be available in CLDR. And
These are
translators they created.
These are to help the translators kind of double check what they're doing. Yeah. Good question, thanks. So, what's our current process? Our current progress is part of it is to identify the good languages, the analytic ones, Chinese, great language, because we don't need to do anything for case or gender or plural. In our first phase, which was in CLDR version 39, we had a preliminary phase where we took a small number of languages because we knew we were going to hit issues and have to work through them and resolve them in order to get the software to clearly present it to the user, to the translator, in a way that they could understand and produce the results. We then had a phase 2 where we expanded the number of locales by 29 and gathered, in this case, we gathered all but the compounds for these things. So the common compounds that I talked about, so for kilometer and square second and so forth. And then in phase 3, we're going to be fleshing out those locales. So at the end of phase 3, then we'll have a full panoply of the most common units across all of these locales. And that phase 3 is coming up in the next CLDR cycle, which will terminate in about roughly 6 months. And all of this work couldn't have happened without all of the people on CLDR. I did a lot of consulting with linguists inside of Google for a lot of the grammatical work, and people on the CLDR committee did the same in talking to their people within their companies. So all of this couldn't have happened without a lot of people working on the result. And I've got, I think, a fair amount of time for question and answers. Good. Okay. So, questions? Yeah.
So one question I have, in the list you had of like 42 locales, a little bit more, you only have the root locales. Would they be the same like for SR, and you have Cyrillic as well as Latin? Would they basically the same grammar that would come out, or different?
It actually we gather the data for different variants. So for Serbian, for example, we gather for, well, Serbian is also a very good language in one respect. It is written with 2 scripts, but you can always algorithmically generate the Latin script from the Cyrillic one. Okay, so Serbian is great, as opposed to something like a lot of languages that have changed script, like Uzbek. They change it, but they also introduce a spelling reform. And so you can't predict what one spelling is going to be in Latin from what it is in Cyrillic or vice versa. And those languages, you just have to gather all of the data twice, one in each script. But the list there are cases where there are different forms based upon regional variants too. There's certainly, we gather just even British English, the spelling for the units are going to be different. Whether or not an inflection differs across different regions, we haven't really hit that a lot, but of course, depending upon how deep you go, you will hit it. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
Yeah. So to make sure I understood correctly, the developer who is, wanting to present this to their user needs to specify the grammatical case as the input. Is that right? Because I'm imagining teaching developers about the 12 finished cases, and that's probably not going to go super well.
Yeah, no, what you would actually do is the original English version of the message on the bottom would be, instead of volume, comma, you need to supply. Instead of, and the English would be, for English you would substitute in, if I went volume, I'd separate gallons, for example. Instead of 3 gallons, I went blah. And in English, you don't have any case, you wouldn't have any case markers in the placeholder, but part of the process of making this real is having provision in the message format so that the translator could say, oh, for my language, this needs to be genitive. Okay, and then the translator can add the marker, and this is pseudo syntax at this point, can add the marker to say this is genitive, and then the software can say, oh, you want the genitive form of 3 gallons, but it's going to be in German, so it's going to be 4.4 liters or something like that. And then we'll put it in, but then pick the genitive form of liters. Yeah. And as I say, I'm not exactly sure what it is, but there's I think it's called message format 2.0 or something like that. They're going to be talking later today, I believe, about the ways in which we're looking at improving message formatting. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
How does CLDR prioritize which locales to take care of next to gain information on next?
Yeah, the question is, how does CLDR prioritize the locales? CLDR is kind of a combination. There are a number of companies that are heavily involved in that, and they have their own sets of locales that they prioritize, and we take roughly the union of those in determining what we, within the committee, focus on. But it's also an open process, so we have a lot of organizations that will get involved and contribute for their language. And there are probably, many of them contribute up to a certain level. We divide it into a basic level, a moderate level, and then modern level is kind of the highest. And so for the core locales that the larger companies are involved with, we have about 80-ish at modern, but there are a handful of locales, among them Cherokee, for example, where there's an engaged enough user community that they keep contributing and fleshing out the support for their language. So that's open. It gets a little bit tricky because we also have to be wary of spam contributors. We don't want people to go in and get an account and then mess with the language just because they like messing with the language. And that happens in today's world. So one of the things we look for is if you just come in and want an account, then we can give you an account, but you get a very low vote for it. And then we look for some kind of language authority or some kind of a university, something where we can point to and say, yes, this looks like a reasonable organization that could have a stronger vote and therefore produce better material, so we will give them an additional vote. So that's how it works. Yeah.
So for a translator to be marking placeholders, say here's the kind of data that we want, are translation tools now providing some capability to do that?
Not yet. This is all a work in progress. We're pushing on the core ability so that you can present it in isolation. So that if you have cases like, which often occur, are you going in March or something like that, where the item can be in the proper case. So there's a certain number of cases. I keep using the word case meaning situations and case meaning grammatical case. Sorry for the confusion. There's a certain number of situations where the isolated form is, having the isolated form is an advantage, but then we also need to push on people to adopt and improve in order to have improved tools for that. Now, some big companies, like my own, are already dealing with having much more sophisticated tools in order to deal with issues like this, and they can adapt their tools for that. In other cases, I'm sure that they will catch up because this is the kind of thing that you need to do for messages in these languages. Yeah?
How are the currencies being different locales may have different currencies.
How are what?
Currency?
Currencies are tricky. There are just too many of them. We currently, as I say, we're approaching the grammatical side currently first with units of measure. Probably we will hit next dates. And dates get very interesting because they're combinations of things. And currencies, just the volume of data gets tricky. So we have to look at that carefully before we take on the currencies because there are, as I say, a lot of currencies. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Here, the usage, how is that categorized? Because it seems if it's really vague and is there an algorithm logic?
Oh, there's like a lot of things, we're driven by need. So people say, oh, we need to talk about people's height. Okay, people's height is clearly different than road length. So we need at least people's height and road length. Okay, and then, oh, well, we're in our application, we need to show the height of mountains. Okay, well, we got another. So a lot of it is driven kind of by customer need. And we don't necessarily have to talk about microbe size, so maybe we don't have that information yet, but we're building up more information about the usages as time goes on. So our main purpose is to identify them clearly and give them an internal identifier which stays stable. Yeah. So person height is an example. Yeah. Road length is another example. Other questions? Yeah.
If we were to recommend the designers, when they design the UIs.
I'm sorry?
About plurals.
Plurals, yeah.
Yeah. Designers, what do we tell them? Recommendation-wise.
I'm not. It's a little, can you speak up? It's a little hard for me to hear from you.
So.
Maybe you can give them an example. Yeah.
Designing people are, designing like UI, using big math and stuff like that. What's our recommendation, for plural, knowing that they don't care about the translate, doesn't translate, they just, try to design it, in terms of English, right, typically.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll describe what process can go on. Is typically the original developer will do the message in English. It doesn't have to be English, but do the message in English. And the message format that's used in ICU allows you to have, for English, you would put in either the category 1 or the category other. And so your message is structured as two separate messages inside a little envelope that says I've got 1: or other : and then I have the messages. I know inside of Google, for example, we support a whole bunch of front ends, and there are probably 10 different formats for those messages. And so all you have to do is be able to translate those into this. Then what happens is that message will go out to the translators, and the translators have the opportunity to change it will show them, okay, I know that you're translating for Slovenian, so I'm going to show you 4 forms. And Slovenian, it's 1, 2, few, and other. So it expands the number of forms so that the Slovenian translator can actually put in 4 different messages for the plurals. And the same thing needs to happen in other cases, is the apparatus that you use to show the messages to the translators needs to know about this stuff to make it easy for the translator. Yeah.
We're just about at time.
Sure.
I just want to have a comment on that because I ran into that in one of my jobs in the past. And one of the ways we solved it is to have a standard taxonomy for the variables. So for instance, in the statement of the user experience design method, standard taxonomy, that this is a counting object, this is a unit object, whatever, and that gives communication for things farther down the line, I feel it creates a different variance that can be translated properly into the grammar. I think we're out of time. So-
Well, thank you for your attention.